The winter wind in Red Creek, Texas carried more than just the sound of rustling leaves. It carried stories. Stories of people who worked hard, lost much, and still tried to keep going. Among them was Clara Dawson, a young woman with tired eyes and a baby boy wrapped tightly in her arms. Clara had once lived in a small white farmhouse on the edge of town. She and her husband, Henry Dawson, had dreamed of turning that patch of dry land into a thriving farm. They planted corn, raised chickens, and built a little life together, one sunrise at a time. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Then came the accident. Henry had gone out to repair the barn roof after a long storm had torn half of it away. The ladder slipped on the wet ground, and by the time help came, it was too late. Clara never forgot the moment she saw the doctor's eyes when he stepped down from his buggy, how he removed his hat and said nothing. She understood before he spoke a single word. Days turned to weeks and weeks to months. Clara tried to keep the farm going, but she couldn't manage alone. Not with the baby and not with the debts piling up. The land agent came one morning, his voice polite but his tone final. The bank had taken the deed. Everything she and Henry had worked for, gone. Clara packed what little she could into one worn suitcase, a few clothes, Henry's Bible, and a silver rattle for baby Samuel. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to go somewhere. Every step she took down that dirt road felt heavier than the last. The people of Red Creek were kind in words but short in help. Some offered a meal. Others offered pity. No one offered a home. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that times were hard for everyone. Drought had dried the fields and money was scarce. Folks barely managed to feed their own. Clara knocked on the door of the small general store. The owner, Mrs. Bailey, looked up with surprise when she saw her. "Clara, honey, you shouldn't be out with that baby in this cold," Mrs. Bailey said, rushing around the counter. Clara smiled faintly. "We're fine, ma'am, just looking for work," Mrs. Bailey sighed. "I wish I had something, but times are rough. You could try the boarding house, though I heard they're full." "Thank you," Clara said softly. She didn't let her voice shake until she stepped outside again. The sky above was gray, heavy with clouds that looked ready to break. She pulled Samuel closer, whispering to him even though he was too young to understand. "Mama's here, sweetheart. We'll be okay. We have to be." She made her way to the small church on the hill, hoping maybe Pastor Green could help. Inside, the air smelled of candle wax and old wood. The pastor was sweeping near the altar when he saw her. "Clara Dawson," he said gently. "I was just praying for you. I was hoping. Maybe there's a room or a place we could stay for a while," she said. "I'll work for it. Clean, cook, anything." He looked at her kindly but shook his head. "The parsonage is full, Clara, but I'll ask around. There's a rancher out west who sometimes needs help with cooking. It's a long ride, though." Clara nodded. "Thank you, Pastor." She left before her tears could fall. That night, she and Samuel stayed in the empty wagon shed behind the old mill. She built a small fire and wrapped them both in her late husband's coat. The wind blew through the cracks and Samuel whimpered softly in his sleep. Clara stroked his hair, whispering lullabies her mother once sang. The stars above were sharp and cold, and she wondered if Henry could see them too. Morning came slow and gray. The fire had gone out and frost painted the edges of the wagon wheels. Clara lifted her baby and started walking again. Her shoes were worn thin, her fingers numb. Every mile of that long Texas road looked the same. Flat fields, wire fences, and a horizon that never seemed to get closer. Just before noon, she heard the distant sound of hooves. She turned to see a man on horseback coming down the trail. His figure was tall, wrapped in a long coat with a hat pulled low against the wind. For a moment she thought about stepping off the road, but there was nowhere to hide. The rider slowed as he came near. He had a rugged, sunburned face, and his eyes, gray and calm, studied her carefully. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "You lost?" Clara hesitated. "No, sir, just walking." "With a baby? Out here?" She didn't answer. She didn't like pity, not even when it came kindly. He looked at the small bundle in her arms. "There's a storm coming. You won't make it far on foot." "I'll manage," she said quickly. He didn't argue. He dismounted slowly, tied his horse's reins to a fence post, and reached into his saddlebag. From it, he pulled a canteen and a small paper-wrapped biscuit. "Here," he said, holding them out. Clara hesitated, then took them. "Thank you." The man nodded once. "Name's Eli Carter. I work over at Coyote Ridge Ranch a few miles that way. He pointed west. Got a spare cabin out there. You and the little one can get warm if you need. Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She had learned the hard way that not all kindness came without cost. But the look in his eyes wasn't pity, it was quiet concern. Honest, steady, still she shook her head. You don't even know us, Eli shrugged. Don't have to. Just know it ain't right seeing a woman and her child out in the cold. The wind picked up, sharper now. The horizon was darkening, the storm was real. Clara looked down at her baby, whose small hands peeked out from the blanket. He was shivering. She bit her lip and looked back at Eli. Are you sure? He nodded once. I don't talk much, ma'am, but I don't lie. Something about the way he said it made her believe him. Eli helped her onto his horse, steadying her carefully as she held Samuel close. They rode in silence through the gathering wind. The sound of hooves on hard earth echoed in rhythm with the baby's soft breathing. As they rode, Clara studied the man who had stopped for her. His clothes were plain but well kept. A scar ran along his jaw, half hidden by the collar of his coat. He looked like someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. After nearly an hour, they reached the edge of a wide stretch of land, a lonely ranch surrounded by open plains. The cabin stood near a line of old cottonwoods, its roof patched with tin, its windows glowing faintly from the light of a stove inside. Eli dismounted and helped Clara down. Ain't much, he said, but it's dry and warm. She stepped inside and felt heat brush against her face for the first time in days. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee. There was a small cot in the corner, a table with 2 chairs and a simple quilt folded neatly on the bed. Eli set a pot of water on the stove. There's stew from last night. Might not taste fancy, but it's hot. Clara's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. Thank you, she whispered. Eli nodded and busied himself with feeding the fire. He didn't ask where she'd come from or why she was alone. He just let her sit, eat, and breathe. For the first time in months, Clara felt the weight on her chest ease a little. Samuel slept peacefully in her arms, his tiny hand resting on her sleeve. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, but inside the small cabin it was quiet, warm, still, almost safe. Eli poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her. After a long silence, he said, You can stay till the storm passes. Clara met his gaze. That's kind of you. He nodded, eyes thoughtful. Ain't kindness, ma'am. It's just the right thing to do. For a long time, neither spoke again. The fire cracked softly, the baby stirred, and the snow began to fall. Clara didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for that night, for the first time since losing Henry, she didn't feel completely alone. And for Eli Carter, the quiet cowboy who had stopped when others looked away, something deep inside began to stir, something he hadn't felt in years. It was the start of a story neither of them saw coming. The morning light crept slowly through the thin curtains of the small cabin. It touched the wooden floorboards, the old chair by the fire, and the little bundle of blankets on the cot where Clara and her baby slept. The air was still except for the soft crackle of dying embers in the stove. Eli Carter had been awake for hours. He was a man who had learned to rise early, before dawn, before the world began to move. He stood by the window, cup of coffee in hand, looking out at the soft snow that had covered the ground overnight. It made the land look peaceful, like the troubles of yesterday were buried beneath a white sheet. When Clara stirred, she blinked against the faint morning light, for a moment forgetting where she was. Then she saw the man by the window, the quiet cowboy who had stopped for her the day before, and remembered. Good morning, she said softly, her voice still rough from sleep. Eli turned slightly, nodding. Mornin'. Coffee's hot. You want some? She smiled a little. If you don't mind. He poured her a tin cup and handed it over. She wrapped her hands around it, feeling the warmth seep into her cold fingers. For a few moments they said nothing. The only sound was Samuel's gentle breathing as he slept, one tiny hand clutching the corner of her shawl. I hope we didn't trouble you last night, Clara said finally. Eli shook his head. Didn't trouble me none. Cabin's been empty too long anyhow. Do you live here alone? He nodded. Been that way a while. Clara wanted to ask why, but she sensed he wasn't the kind of man who liked questions. His silence didn't feel rude, it felt heavy, like it carried stories he wasn't ready to tell. After a while, Eli put on his coat and said, "Gotta check the horses." "You'll be all right here?" She nodded. "We'll be fine." He stepped outside, and the cold air rushed in for a moment before the door shut again. Clara looked around the cabin, small but tidy, everything in its place. There was a shelf with a few books, a lantern, and an old photograph of a younger man standing beside a horse. She guessed it was Eli. Samuel woke and began to fuss, so she fed him and hummed a quiet tune. The warmth of the room and the smell of coffee made her feel for the first time in months that she wasn't just surviving, she was resting. When Eli returned, snow clung to his hat brim. "The storm's easing," he said. "By tomorrow the roads might clear." Clara nodded, though a small part of her wasn't sure she wanted to leave so soon. As the day went on, she offered to help with chores. "You've done enough for me," she said. "Let me do something in return." Eli hesitated, then handed her a bucket. "Well, if you insist. There's water down by the well. Just don't slip on the path," she smiled faintly. "I've walked worse roads." When she returned, her cheeks were pink from the cold, but there was light in her eyes. She looked younger, livelier than she had since Henry's passing. Eli noticed but didn't say a word. He spent most of the afternoon mending a broken fence rail outside, while Clara swept the floor and cooked what she could from the food he had. It wasn't much, just potatoes, beans, and dried meat, but she made it smell like home. As evening fell, they sat together at the small table. Samuel lay in a basket nearby, cooing softly. "It's been a long time since this cabin's seen company," Eli said quietly. Clara smiled. "Well, I'm glad we could keep it from getting too lonely." Eli chuckled, a low sound that surprised her. She hadn't heard him laugh before. It was rough, unpracticed, but it warmed the air. They ate in companionable silence. The fire crackled, shadows danced on the walls, and the baby's soft sighs filled the spaces between their words. When Clara washed the dishes afterward, Eli stepped outside again, leaning against the porch rail and staring out at the fading light. The land stretched endlessly before him. White fields, gray sky, a world too wide and too quiet. He didn't hear her come out at first. "It's beautiful out here," she said, standing beside him. He nodded. "Some say so. Others say it's lonely." "Maybe it's both," she said. "Sometimes beauty hides in the quiet." He looked at her then, really looked. Her face was tired, but there was strength in it too. She wasn't fragile even after all she'd been through. She was still standing, still carrying on. "You talk like someone who's seen a lot," he said. Clara smiled faintly. "I've seen enough to know that sometimes the world takes what it wants and all we can do is keep walking." Eli nodded slowly. "That's truth right there." They stood together for a while, listening to the wind in the cottonwood trees. It wasn't the kind of silence that hurt. It was the kind that healed. When they went back inside, the baby stirred, and Eli watched as Clara lifted him gently, whispering soft words. There was something peaceful about the way she moved, like she carried both sorrow and grace in the same breath. He turned away, not wanting her to see the look in his eyes. Later that night, after she and Samuel had gone to sleep, Eli sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He thought about the woman sleeping under his roof, a stranger who had already filled the cabin with warmth he hadn't felt in years. He thought of the photo on the shelf, of his own brother who had passed years before, leaving him alone with a ranch that had grown quieter with each season. Maybe, he thought, some people were meant to be alone. But when he heard the baby's soft cry in the next room, he wasn't sure anymore. The next morning, Clara awoke to find a loaf of bread and a small jar of honey on the table. A note beside it, written in careful handwriting, said, "Figured you and the boy could use this." She smiled as she read it. Outside, she saw him working near the barn, fixing a broken gate. She stepped out, baby in arms, and said, "You didn't have to do this." He shrugged. "Didn't have to. Wanted to." Samuel laughed then, a soft, bubbling sound that made Eli glance up. The sight of that tiny, smiling face caught him off guard. He smiled back, a little awkwardly, but it was real. Over the next few days, a quiet rhythm formed. Clara cooked, swept, and cared for the baby. Eli worked outside but often stopped by the cabin, sometimes with an extra log for the fire, sometimes just to check if she needed anything. They didn't talk much, but they didn't have to. There was comfort in the simple presence of another soul nearby. One afternoon, when the sun finally broke through the clouds, Eli saddled his horse and said, You should see the ridge when it's clear. You and the boy can ride with me if you'd like. Clara hesitated. I've never ridden before. He smiled, a small curve of his lips. Then you'll learn. She laughed softly, something she hadn't done in a long while. He helped her up, careful and gentle, making sure Samuel was held safely in her arms. Together they rode to the top of the ridge where the land rolled out beneath them like an ocean of gold and white. It's beautiful, she whispered. Eli nodded. Henry used to bring me up here, she added quietly. He said the land looked like heaven from up high. Eli didn't speak, just let her words hang in the air. Then he said softly, maybe he was right. For a moment, she felt a peace she hadn't known since before Henry died. The wind brushed her hair, the sun warmed her face, and the sound of the horses' slow breathing filled the silence. By the time they returned, the baby had fallen asleep. Clara thanked him and Eli tipped his hat, pretending not to notice the tears glimmering in her eyes. That night, as the firelight flickered on the cabin walls, Clara thought about the man who had stopped when no one else did. He didn't ask for thanks or offer promises, he simply helped, and that, she realized, was rarer than gold. For Eli, watching her and the baby had awakened something quiet and unfamiliar. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close. Something that made him listen for laughter, notice the smell of bread baking, and think about tomorrow in a way he hadn't for years. Neither of them said it aloud, but both knew their lives had begun to shift, like spring beneath melting snow. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, for now they were no longer two strangers on separate paths. They were, slowly, quietly, becoming a kind of family neither of them had expected to find. The days at the small cabin began to blend into a gentle rhythm. The snow melted, leaving soft mud and the faint smell of grass in the air. Each morning, Clara rose before sunrise, wrapped Samuel in a warm blanket, and watched Eli ride out to work at the ranch. She would see him from the porch, his figure strong and steady against the pale sky, and something inside her would calm, as if his presence promised that the world was still kind somewhere. She would spend her mornings washing clothes, mending his shirts or cooking small meals with whatever they had. Life wasn't easy, but it was peaceful, and that peace began to feel precious. Sometimes when Eli returned at dusk, they would talk by the fire. Not much, just a few words here and there, but each word carried meaning. They spoke about the weather, the ranch, the town, and sometimes quietly their pasts. One evening, as Samuel slept in his cradle, Clara asked softly, "Do you ever get lonely out there all by yourself?" Eli stared into the fire for a moment. "Used to," he said. "But after a while you stop feeling lonely, you just get used to the quiet." She nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I used to think that too. But then the quiet started feeling heavier, like it wanted to swallow me whole." Eli looked up at her, his gray eyes calm but filled with something unspoken. "Then it's a good thing you're not alone now." Clara smiled faintly. "It is." For the first time in a long time she felt seen, not as a widow, not as a woman to be pitied, but as a person still standing. The next morning, dark clouds rolled across the horizon. The air was heavy and even the horses grew restless. Eli noticed it right away. "Storm's coming," he said, glancing toward the west. Clara looked up from the porch, holding Samuel. "Will it be bad?" "Could be. Spring storms out here move fast." By noon, the sky had turned the color of iron. The wind picked up, whistling through the cottonwood trees, and dust began to swirl across the open field. Eli worked quickly to bring the cattle closer to shelter, his voice calm but firm as he guided them. Clara stood in the doorway, clutching Samuel, worry pressing in on her chest. She wanted to call out, but Eli was already far across the pasture, his figure small against the darkening clouds. The first rumble of thunder rolled over the land. Then came the rain, soft at first, then fierce, drumming against the roof like fists. Clara hurried to close the shutters and fed the fire, her heart racing. Eli returned soaked, his coat dripping water onto the wooden floor. "It's rough out there," he said, catching his breath. "The river's rising faster than it should. I'll have to check the far gate before nightfall." "You can't go back out in that," she said quickly. He gave her a small, tired smile. "I'll be fine. I've seen worse." "Please," she whispered, gripping his arm. "It's dangerous." He looked at her hand, small and trembling against his sleeve. Something in his chest tightened. "I'll be careful," he promised. Then gently he pulled away and stepped back into the rain. The hours crawled by. The storm grew louder, lightning flashing across the sky, shaking the walls of the cabin. Samuel whimpered, and Clara held him close, whispering, "It's all right, baby. It's just thunder. It'll pass soon." But the thunder didn't pass, it grew, and Eli didn't return. When night fell and he still hadn't come back, fear took hold of her. She wrapped Samuel in his blanket, pulled on her coat, and stepped outside. The rain was cold and blinding, but she couldn't sit and wait any longer. She could see the faint glow of lanterns near the ranch fence line, and knew that's where Eli must have gone. "Hold on, little one," she murmured to her son. "We're going to find him." The mud sucked at her boots as she pushed forward. The wind whipped at her hair and clothes. Every step felt harder than the last, but she kept going, driven by something stronger than fear. Finally, through the curtain of rain, she saw movement near the edge of the field, a horse struggling in the floodwater, and beside it Eli fighting to pull it free. "Eli!" she shouted, her voice barely carrying over the storm. He looked up, startled. "Clara, what are you—" Before he could finish, she was already there, clutching Samuel to her chest and reaching for the rope tied around the horse. "You shouldn't be here," he yelled. "You shouldn't either." She shot back. "You'll drown out here." Together, they pulled with all their strength until the frightened animal broke free from the fence. The water was cold and fierce, splashing against their legs. Eli grabbed Clara's hand, steadying her as she stumbled. "This way," he shouted. They made it to higher ground, breathless and soaked through. The horse trotted behind them, snorting nervously. Eli looked at her, his face dripping with rain. "You could have been hurt." She met his gaze, her eyes wide but steady. "So could you." He wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached for Samuel, checking that the baby was warm and dry. "He's all right?" Clara nodded. "He's fine." They stood there for a long moment, thunder echoing across the hills. Then slowly, Eli reached out and touched Clara's shoulder. "Let's get you both home." Back at the cabin, Clara wrapped Samuel in a dry blanket and set him near the fire. Eli sat nearby, wringing out his sleeves, watching the flames flicker across the room. "You're stubborn," he said finally, his voice rough but gentle. "So are you," she replied. Glancing up, he gave a small laugh, shaking his head. "You remind me of my mother. She used to say storms bring out the truth in people." "What truth did this one bring out?" Clara asked softly. He paused. "That I've been alone too long. And that maybe I don't have to be." The words hung in the air, soft but powerful. Clara felt her heart beat faster. She didn't know what to say, so she said the only thing that came to her. "Sometimes life gives us people we didn't expect. Maybe that's its way of giving us another chance." Eli looked at her then, really looked, and the silence between them grew warm. Not awkward, but full of things neither dared to say aloud. Outside, the storm began to fade. The wind softened, and the sound of rain became gentle again. Inside the cabin, Samuel slept peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the quiet crackle of the fire. Eli leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling into his bones. "You should rest," he said softly. "So should you," Clara replied. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I will." As the night deepened, Clara sat by the fire, watching the light dance over Eli's face. For the first time, she saw something behind his calm, the tired heart of a man who had carried too much for too long. She thought of her own pain, of Henry, of the farm they had lost. And she realized something she hadn't before. Maybe she and Eli weren't just two broken souls passing through the same storm. Maybe they were the shelter each other had been searching for. When she finally lay down, the cabin was quiet except for the soft sound of rain against the roof. The world outside was still dark, but inside there was warmth. A small, flickering light that felt like hope. And though neither of them said it out loud, both knew the truth. Something had changed that night. They had gone into the storm as strangers who shared a roof. They came out of it as something more. Something fragile but real, like the first light after rain. The morning after the storm, everything was quiet. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the world outside the cabin shimmered with sunlight. The fields glowed green again, and drops of water clung to the grass like tiny stars. It was as if the land itself was taking a deep breath after holding it through the long night. Clara stood at the door, Samuel in her arms, watching the sunlight dance on puddles that reflected the sky. Behind her, Eli was fixing a loose plank in the wall that the wind had shaken loose. His sleeves were rolled up and his hair was still damp. "You don't rest much, do you?" she asked, smiling faintly. He glanced up at her, half smiling. "The work doesn't do itself." She laughed softly, the sound bright against the still morning air. "You remind me of Henry. He was the same way, always fixing something even when it didn't need fixing." Eli paused, the hammer still in his hand. "He sounds like a good man." "He was," Clara said quietly. "He was kind. He always believed things would get better no matter how hard they were." Eli nodded. "Sounds like something worth believing." She looked at him for a moment, her eyes soft. "Maybe it is." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was warm like sunlight on old wood. Over the next few weeks, the land around Coyote Ridge began to bloom again. The river calmed, the grass grew tall, and wildflowers began to cover the hills in gentle color. Clara started planting a small garden near the cabin, just a few herbs and vegetables, but it gave her something to do with her hands, something that felt like home. Eli built her a small fence around it. Though she hadn't asked. "You didn't have to," she said, smiling as she watched him work. He shrugged, figured it'd keep the rabbits out. "Maybe the wind too," she laughed. "Maybe." He looked up, meeting her eyes for a moment longer than usual. Then he went back to his hammering, pretending not to notice the warmth rising in his chest. Days turned into a quiet pattern. Mornings began with coffee and laughter from Samuel, who had learned to giggle whenever Eli made faces at him. Afternoons were filled with chores and simple talk, Clara hanging laundry while Eli worked with the horses. In the evenings, they'd sit outside and watch the sunset spill gold across the sky. Clara had begun to smile more. The sadness that once shadowed her face was still there, but it no longer owned her. Sometimes, when the wind blew softly through her hair, she looked free, like the world was slowly giving her back her joy. Eli noticed everything. He noticed how her laughter made the cabin feel alive again, how Samuel's laughter echoed like a promise of new beginnings, and how, for the first time in years, he didn't dread the sound of silence. He had lived most of his life in quiet, convincing himself that it was easier that way. But now, when he walked into the cabin and heard Clara humming a tune or saw the baby crawling across the floor, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel in years: belonging. One afternoon, while Eli was repairing the barn door, Clara came out with 2 mugs of lemonade. The air was warm and the sun made the world glow. "Thought you could use a break," she said. He took the mug with a nod. "Thanks, you always know when I need one." She smiled. "I suppose I'm starting to learn your ways." He chuckled softly, then turned to look at the open land beyond the barn. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "Leaving?" He nodded. "You and Samuel. You could go back to town, start fresh. Folks might help you find work." Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the open sky, then at him. "Maybe I could, but—" She paused, her voice softening. "There's something about this place. About you. It feels safe, like it's where we're meant to be right now." Eli's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say. Words had never come easy to him, especially when they mattered. He finally managed, "Then I'm glad you're here." She smiled, and in that moment, nothing else needed to be said. As spring turned to early summer, the ranch came back to life. The owner, old Mr. Howard, came around more often, checking on the land and the workers. He was a kind man, but gruff, always chewing on a piece of straw and talking like he'd seen everything twice. One morning, he rode up to the cabin and found Clara hanging clothes outside. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Didn't know Eli had company." Clara smiled politely. "We're just staying for a while." "He's been very kind to us." Mr. Howard nodded. "Eli's got a good heart. Doesn't say much, but he's steady as they come." He looked around the cabin and then back at her. "You folks seem to have made yourselves a home." Clara blushed slightly. "I suppose we have." When Eli returned from the fields, Mr. Howard gave him a knowing look. "You've done a fine job with the place, son. And that little family in there, they're better off for knowing you." Eli didn't answer. He just nodded, though inside his thoughts ran deeper than words could reach. That evening, when he came inside, Clara was rocking Samuel to sleep. The glow from the fire lit her face softly. She looked up at him and smiled, whispering, "He's growing fast." Eli smiled. "He's got strong lungs. Gonna be a talker, that one." She laughed quietly. "Maybe he'll teach you how." He raised an eyebrow, pretending to frown. You saying I talk too little? She grinned. Maybe just enough. They both laughed then. Real laughter, the kind that comes from peace, not just politeness. As the days grew longer, their bond deepened in ways neither planned. There were small moments that built something strong between them. A shared meal, a look across the room, a hand offered without being asked. One evening, while Eli was mending a saddle strap, Clara sat by the window, sewing a small blanket for Samuel. The sunset painted the sky in colors of fire and rose. She said quietly, "It's strange. I used to think my life ended the day Henry died. But now," she paused, looking down at her hands, "now I think maybe it was just changing." Eli looked up, his eyes meeting hers. Change doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes it's just a new beginning in disguise. Her lips trembled into a soft smile. You always know what to say, don't you? He shook his head. Not always. Just this once. Their eyes held for a moment longer than they should have, and the air between them felt warm, alive, and full of something new. Clara looked away first, but her heart was racing. She didn't know what to call what she felt. It wasn't the same as before with Henry. It was quieter, deeper. It wasn't about promises or dreams. It was about finding peace where there used to be pain. That night, after Clara went to bed, Eli stepped outside. The stars were bright, scattered across the wide Texas sky. He leaned against the porch rail, listening to the soft wind and the faint sound of Samuel's breathing through the open window. For years, he had lived believing his life was meant to be quiet and lonely. He had lost people, seen hard times, and closed his heart to keep it from breaking again. But now, with Clara and her baby sleeping under his roof, that loneliness didn't fit anymore. He looked at the light glowing softly through the cabin window and whispered, "Maybe this is what home feels like." The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of biscuits and coffee. Eli was at the stove, apron on, humming under his breath. "You're cooking?" she asked, surprised. He smiled. "Figured it was my turn." She laughed, shaking her head. "You're full of surprises, Eli Carter." He placed a biscuit on her plate, golden and steaming. "Maybe I've just had good company lately." Clara smiled, her eyes shining. "Maybe we both have." The days that followed were filled with small joys. Samuel's first steps, the sound of Clara singing while she worked, the comfort of shared silence. Neither of them said the words, forming quietly in their hearts, but they didn't need to. It was there in every smile, every glance. Every quiet evening when the world outside the cabin faded into peace. Life hadn't given them what they expected, but it had given them something even better, a second chance. And as the sun set one evening, painting the sky in colors of hope, Eli reached out, gently took Clara's hand, and said softly, "We've come a long way, haven't we?" She smiled, eyes full of warmth. "Yes," she whispered, "and maybe the best part's still ahead." The days after spring turned fully into summer felt lighter than Clara remembered. The sun rose earlier, filling the small cabin with golden light that seemed to touch everything with a gentle warmth. Samuel had grown more curious each day, toddling around the cabin and yard, his laughter echoing over the open fields. It was a sound that filled the house in a way that nothing else could, bringing smiles to both Clara and Eli. Clara found herself humming while she worked, planting more herbs in the garden, washing clothes under the warm sun, and baking simple bread and pies. Every small task seemed to hold a new meaning now. Each movement was a reminder that life could continue, even after loss, and that joy could grow from the smallest seeds. Eli worked outside most of the day, tending to the horses and repairing fences, but he often paused to watch Clara, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but quietly with a soft admiration in his gray eyes. He noticed how she laughed when Samuel pulled at her skirts, how carefully she spoke to the baby, and the way her hands moved as she worked. He saw a strength in her that didn't need words to be understood. One warm morning, Eli approached her as she planted a row of vegetables. "That tomato plant," he said, pointing to one that leaned slightly to the side. "It needs a little support." "I can fix that," Clara smiled. "Thank you. You've been fixing everything around here lately. Maybe I should start calling you the caretaker of the cabin." Eli laughed softly, brushing dirt from his hands. "I'm just doing what needs to be done. Can't let the garden topple over before it grows." She nodded, laughing. "You sound like a teacher. Are you always this serious about small things?" "Not always," he said with a hint of a smile. But sometimes the small things matter more than we think. Clara looked at him thoughtfully. He had a way of saying simple words that seemed to carry more weight than anyone else's. Days flowed into weeks and summer grew stronger. Samuel took his first real steps one afternoon in the garden. He stumbled a few times, arms outstretched, then fell into Clara's arms with a giggle. She held him tightly, laughing along with him while Eli watched from a distance, his face softening into a proud, quiet smile. "It's amazing," Clara said softly, holding Samuel close. "He's growing so fast," Eli nodded. "Just like the garden. Takes care, patience, and a little love." Clara looked at him, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and something more. She realized that Eli had become a part of her life in a way she hadn't expected. He wasn't just a helper or a friend. He was someone who made her feel safe, someone who made her believe in small joys again. That evening, they all sat outside, watching the sun dip behind the rolling hills. Samuel dozed in his blanket, tired from the day's adventures. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and gold, and the warm wind carried the soft scent of wildflowers. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered. Eli glanced at her, then at the horizon. "It is. Makes you believe that the world isn't so harsh after all." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling a comfort she hadn't known for years. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what really matters," she said softly. He nodded, letting her words settle between them. As summer deepened, Clara began to think about the future more clearly. She wanted to make a home here, not just a place to stay. She wanted Samuel to grow up knowing warmth, laughter, and love. And she wanted Eli to know that he could have that too, not just the land and the quiet, but the family that was slowly forming under his roof. One afternoon, she found Eli sitting by the barn staring at the horizon. "Thinking about the future?" she asked, walking up to him. He nodded slowly. "Always. Been thinking about what comes next. About the farm. About life. About you and Samuel." Clara felt a rush of emotion. "And?" He looked at her, the sunlight catching his hair. "I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I know I don't want to imagine it without you two." Her heart swelled and she reached for his hand. "We've both lost so much, Eli, but maybe we're finding it again in a new way." He squeezed her hand gently. "I hope so." It wasn't a confession of love yet. Not in words, but it was there in every gesture, in every shared smile, in the quiet mornings and warm evenings. The ranch slowly returned to full life. Mr. Howard, the owner, came around more often, checking the animals and crops. He noticed the little cabins change. It seemed brighter now, filled with laughter and light. "You've made quite a place here, Eli," he said one morning, tipping his hat. "And you've got company now too, it seems." Eli shrugged, but there was a quiet pride in his smile. "She's made it feel like home." Mr. Howard nodded. "That's the hardest part sometimes. Finding a home is more than just walls and a roof. You two are lucky to have found each other." Eli didn't answer, but he looked toward Clara, who was tending to Samuel in the garden. Lucky wasn't the right word. He thought about it carefully. Perhaps it wasn't luck at all, it was choice. It was kindness, courage, and heart that had brought them here. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the sky in deep gold and soft lavender, Clara and Eli sat on the porch steps. Samuel slept peacefully in his crib inside, his tiny chest rising and falling with soft rhythm. Clara spoke first, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Do you ever think about forever?" Eli looked at her, his gray eyes calm but thoughtful. "All the time," he admitted. "But I don't think about forever in terms of plans. I think about it in terms of moments. Moments like this, like seeing Samuel laugh, like sitting here with you." She smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. "I never thought I'd feel this. Happy again. Not after losing Henry." He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sometimes happiness comes slowly, but when it comes, it's worth holding on to." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the warmth of the day fade into a gentle evening chill. "I think we found something good here." Eli didn't speak. He simply held her hand and let the quiet stretch between them, full of unspoken understanding. Weeks turned into months. Summer passed and the land ripened with the golden hues of late summer. Samuel learned to run, to play, and to call both Clara and Eli by name with growing confidence. Every morning the cabin was filled with small noises, laughter, playful shouts, the patter of tiny feet, and every evening, The porch glowed softly as they watched the sunset together. One day, Clara looked out over the fields, noticing how the light touched everything. "It's amazing," she said softly, "how much life can grow in one small place." Eli stood beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It is, and it grows because we care for it. Because we care for each other," she smiled. "And Samuel," he nodded. "Especially Samuel." The baby's laughter echoed from the yard, and for a moment, the world felt perfectly complete. As summer turned into early autumn, Clara realized that the past, with all its grief and loss, had given way to a future filled with hope. She had found a home here, not just in the cabin or on the ranch, but in Eli. And Eli, who had lived years believing he was destined to be alone, had discovered the warmth of love and family again. One evening, while Samuel slept, Clara placed her hand on Eli's arm. "We've been through storms, haven't we?" He looked down at her, smiling softly. "We have. But look where we are now." "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "And I wouldn't change a single thing." He leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "Neither would I." The cabin was quiet, the stars sparkling in the clear sky above. The fire had burned down to embers, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath, as if honoring the peace and love inside. Clara and Eli sat together, hands entwined, watching the night settle around them. Samuel's soft breathing reminded them of the future ahead, a future bright with promise, laughter, and love. It wasn't just a new beginning for Clara, or for Eli. It was a new beginning for all three of them, a small family forged in kindness, trust, and quiet courage. And as the wind rustled the trees outside, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth, Clara realized that life had given her a gift more precious than she could have imagined. A home, a family, and the certainty that even after great loss, happiness could bloom again. Eli squeezed her hand gently. "Here's to what comes next," he whispered. Clara rested her head against his shoulder and smiled. "Here's to everything." The cabin glowed softly in the night, a place of warmth, love, and hope. And for the first time in many years, all three of them knew they had truly come home.